This is Chris Lobban and Maria Schefter, your COVID-19 field trip team, on our way to visit some wetlands, that is, places that are both wet and land, including streams, shallow ponds, estuaries, and places where the soil is wet enough to support a particular plant community. We will start at Masso Reservoir Nature Park, meeting Brent Tibbetts, Department of Agriculture and Wildlife Resources, who has been the driving force behind this restoration program since its inception in 2006. Later we will go to an estuary to see a freshwater marsh and a mangrove swamp.
All right, good morning. Welcome to the Masso Reservoir Nature Area. We're going to be taking you around the Masso Reservoir today and then some of the different ecosystems that are found around it. Behind me you see the Masso Reservoir. This reservoir was built by the Navy just after the Second World War with the idea that this is going to be the drinking water source for Big Navy. After they built it, after a few years, they abandoned the site because of chronic sedimentation. There was always too much mud in the water, it was too costly to make it drinkable, and the mud kept clogging their equipment. So the Navy abandoned this site in 1951 and built Fenna Lake and Fenna Dam on Naval Magazine. That is now the drinking water source for Big Navy. So this sat abandoned for about 50 years. In 2006 was given to the Department of Agriculture. At that time, we started getting permitting to turn this into an area for fishing. We dredged the reservoir out in 2010, took out about 15,000 cubic yards of mud. To give you an idea of how much that is, a dump truck load is about 15 cubic yards. So we took about 1,000 dump trucks worth of mud out of the reservoir. That's what it accumulated over the years. We refilled the reservoir, and then in 2011 we put in the fishing platform. Since 2011, we've been stocking the reservoir with native fish to make it an area for people to go fishing. It's also a very important habitat for aquatic birds that live on Guam, including the endemic Marianas moorhen, an endangered species of bird that you can see swimming around on the reservoir here.
In the spillway, where the water is shallow, we can see big freshwater prawns, which are detritivores, numerous herbivorous thiarid snails, the long pointed shells, and several small native gobies, almost invisible against the silty background until they swim. Floating at the surface in deeper water, we see abundant pondweed, and on it the big herbivorous apple snail. Here you can also see some of the many mosquito fish swimming. These are food for the sport fish that have been stocked here.
Now that the reservoir has been re-established as a fishing area, we know that sedimentation is a problem. It was a problem when the Navy built it, and it continues to be a problem today. So now most of the work that goes on around the reservoir is to address erosion and make sure the sedimentation is reduced. And the best way to do that is by restoring vegetation into the land around the reservoir. So most of the rest of the trip today will be looking at some of the different plants around the reservoir and the planting efforts that have been going on. For addressing the erosion, we were going to plant trees in the area around the reservoir. The plan at the beginning was to plant 15,000 trees, and we're currently at about 14,300. So we're getting close to that, but we're not going to stop at 15,000. We're going to keep on planting trees in here. It's a great area for native trees, some rare native trees, and some trees that are either used for medicinal purposes or for food. We'll be planting those in here as well to make this an area for people to use.
Among the native trees that have been planted are pago, which is common especially near wetlands, native seeded breadfruit, and the rare native plumeria. Along the way we also see fago, which is common in the limestone forest, and lada or noni, which tolerates several different habitats. Brent tells us that they have a big project underway now to renew the signage and upgrade the fishing platform and the boardwalks on the trail, which are the worse for wear after more than 10 years. As we start in along the trail, we pass through a pandanus grove before reaching a low spot where Brent explains how to know that we are in a wetland.
No white stripe in the leaf.
Huh.
The solid green leaf is a wetland indicator. If they have a white stripe, they're not a wetland indicator.
Huh.
And Phragmites is about the only tall grass on Guam that does not have the white stripe.
Here is a close-up of a Phragmites leaf, and a little further along the trail on higher ground we find a grass with a white stripe, not in a wetland. The trail continues up onto the ridge that separates the north and south forks of the Masso River, where we find some small volcanic boulders.
Who's in there?
Nobody's in there. It's a piece of black volcanic rock. Notice the colour and texture of the rock in contrast to limestone. At the top we look out through the acacia plantations to the grassy hilltops on the opposite banks of each fork.
Yeah. What is it?
Smell like root beer?
Yes, it does.
Okay, go ahead and
sniff it.
show us the smell, yeah. Root beer, eh?
Root beer, yeah.
As on all our field trips, the animals tend to be scarce, small and fast. We did catch a glimpse of a native blue-tailed skink, a grasshopper, some mud dauber wasps collecting for their nests at the edge of this puddle, dragonflies, whose larvae are probably in the puddle, and these tadpoles, which Brent told us are barking frogs, being smaller and grey, whereas toad tadpoles are larger and black.
Department of Agriculture. This is an experimental planting area. So the Department of Agriculture brought in 50 or 60 different kinds of trees and planted them here just to see if they would live. One of the trees we brought in were the African tulip trees, large orange flowers, and they have turned out to be very invasive.
Yes.
And crowd out native vegetation, and they don't have good wood for anything. Now they're a pest. So now currently the Department of Agriculture has grants to get rid of African tulips that they brought in the 70s. So it's kind of weird job security. You paid to bring them in the 70s, you paid to get rid of them in the 2020s. Yeah, I'd like to remind everybody that this is a public facility. You're welcome to come in anytime and go fishing or hiking or bird watching, or just come down and take a lunch and rest for a little while. It's open 24/7. You don't need a license or anything to go fishing in here, and come down and just enjoy it. It's a facility for the general public of Guam.
And you don't need a mask as long as you keep 6 feet away
That's
from
right.
strangers.
Practice proper social distancing. You can come down here and stay 6 feet apart from your friends and enjoy it.
The Laguas estuary is a highly disturbed area crossed by a massive wall, a causeway from Marine Corps Drive, that restricts the river outflow to a narrow stream on the east end. On the seaward side there is a large but stunted mangrove forest that was replanted decades ago after a spill from an oil pipeline. The substrate, the ground, in this mangrove is quite rocky, with little mud compared to normal mangroves, which are impossible to walk through. An estuary occurs at the mouth of a river where fresh water flowing down floats over the wedge of salt water pushed up by the tide. Each species has its own salinity tolerance. These reeds, just on the seaward side of the road, occur only this far in the estuary. Further out is too salty. On the inland side, they are the dominant plant in the marsh, though at this time of year they are very dry. There are 3 species of mangrove tree here. Let's take a look at the biodiversity. Look at the shapes of the leaves, flowers and roots. All the mangrove trees have pneumorrhizae, roots adapted to get air because they don't live in soil, but in mud which is waterlogged and lacking oxygen because of the decomposition taking place. The most common is the red mangrove, easily recognized by its red prop roots curving down from the trunk. It has large, thick leaves, sturdy white flowers, and the seeds start to germinate while the fruit is still on the tree. The least common species is the red-flowered mangrove, which has red flowers and small, thick leaves. Inland of the red mangrove is the white mangrove, also called the black mangrove, Avicennia alba, which has thousands of small, short branches from main roots just below the surface. Its leaves are larger than Lemnitzera's but more delicate, pointed, and whitish on the underside. These pneumorrhizae get covered in mud and microorganisms. The sheen on these is an indication of algae growing on the mud. Mangroves are much less diverse than a terrestrial forest because of the stressful environment. These Pneumorrhizae at high tide are covered by salt water, and the forest looks even stranger than here. There are two very common animals in the mangrove. Both live in burrows, but today we saw only fiddler crabs. The fiddler crabs are dimorphic. The males brandish one huge red claw, which they use for territorial disputes and mating displays. The females do not have this large organ. Our fiddler crabs feed on mud. They are detritivores, but on other tropical islands there are carnivorous species. The other denizen of the mud is the mudskipper, a fascinating fish that can walk on water and perch in air on exposed rocks and prop roots of the red mangrove, surviving by holding water in their gill pouches. There were mudskippers here somewhere, but today we saw only the chimneys of their burrows. They must have skipped out. So I am telling you about them while you continue to look at the crabs. Oh, and there he goes. For the last part of the tour, we crossed the road to look at the zonation around the marsh. This wetland is a marsh because it has grasses and sedges rather than trees. In the middle, where it will be flooded in the rainy season, are the sedges. Around the back rim of the marsh, where the ground is slightly higher, wet but only periodically flooded, there is a yellowish-green zone of Phragmites, which, as Brent explained, is a wetland indicator plant. Behind, still higher up the slope, the vegetation becomes woody, first with pago and then with dryland plants. Along the east edge, where the river flows, are tall red mangrove trees. You can see how tall they are compared to the power pole. They were not impacted by the oil spill. The view across the road shows how stunted the trees are on that side. And that is the end of the tour. Thanks again to Brent Tibbetts for showing us the Masso Reservoir.